Okay, today we're going to talk about feelings, whether they can be conscious or unconscious. Now, I split it up into attitudes, the first half of the lecture, and then emotions. Attitude means different things to different academics, and the way I'm using it is the way the social psychologist uses it, meaning a positive or negative evaluation of something. So it's how much you like something. So the question is, could you have unconscious liking, something like liking? And we've touched on liking and subliminal perception before when we talked about the mere exposure effect. If you remember that, you can present shapes or just different stimuli to people, and they come to like them from mere exposure. And you can obtain that effect even when the initial presentation is subliminal. But that doesn't mean that the liking is unconscious. It was just the perception of the stimulus was unconscious, and that created in those experiments conscious liking. And it was conscious liking because the person reported how much they liked the stimuli. So what we've touched on so far might be unconscious determinants of liking, but not unconscious liking per se. So that raises the question, could attitudes themselves be unconscious? And that's what I want to address. So just to tell you, really this is a similar sort of experiment as the mere exposure one in some ways, but I'll just take you through it. They took some cocaine addicts and then showed them photos which you can have a positive valence for, you should like, including cocaine cues if you're a cocaine addict, naked bodies, neutral or aversive, aversive, like, I'm not sure what this is, a scraped leg that's been injured. And they just showed them these images flashed very quickly in fMRI and showed that reward centres lit up for the rewarding stimuli as opposed to the other stimuli, either cocaine or sexual. So there was evidence there for a reward response or a liking response in terms of the brain areas that became active in the comparison of the cocaine and sexual cues compared to the neutral or aversive. Now, subjects were then shown the images at the same display rate as in the experiment and were asked to classify which the four categories did they come from. Now, the authors claim they classified at chance on this. So these were subliminal by an objective threshold. In previous lectures, I had taken their word on that. But just before this one, I went back to look at their materials, and they're quite wrong. Subjects were actually rather remarkably above chance on this test, so their claims are inaccurate. So that kind of undermines the experiment. But anyway, let's just say people were close to chance. Does this tell us anything about the feeling of being rewarded or liking or positive appraisal towards something, being conscious or unconscious? Just introduce yourself to the person next to you and say if this presents any evidence for feelings themselves being unconscious. Any thoughts? you have to know if you like. You have to know that you like if you like something.
You have to know that, I mean, probably, for example, if they were shown, if they're cocaine addicts and they showed something that, a cocaine cue that triggered their desire for cocaine, they're going to feel a rush of craving, that they want the cocaine because they like the cocaine. So I think they already know that they like the cocaine because they're addicted to it. So you have that higher thought thing, I'm addicted because I know that I like cocaine, so this picture is going to trigger my craving of cocaine because I like it.
Yes, so the point is cocaine addicts know that they get cravings when they see cocaine cues. I mean, they're aware of these cravings, and that is true in their general life. But let's say these stimuli were subliminal, which I now doubt, but let's say they didn't know they were looking at cocaine-relevant cues. So that normal, everyday life, all they see is a flash in their mind. Would that be better evidence than...
So, what were they asked specifically? Were they asked to classify it, or were they asked how does it make...
In the fMRI phase, they just look at these pictures, they just look at these flashes on the screen, and then the brain activation is recorded. But then in the later phase, they classify to check for subliminality.
Because I think there may be some difference. Like, if I'm to classify, I can say something is aversive, but I may not necessarily feel, unless it's very specifically asked, how do you feel? How did it make you feel?
Yes. So I think a good point is they didn't ask the subjects how did they feel. So it may be, even if they saw a flash, they might have been aware, as you were saying, of a craving. So the craving itself might have been quite conscious. So we don't know from this whether their cravings, feelings, and likings and so on, and wants, were conscious or unconscious. Does it make sense?
I'm confused. Then what would they? So they were showed a flash in a picture.
Mm-hmm.
Too fast for them to actually see it. Right?
That was the claim, although that claim I now don't believe. But yeah, let's just say yes.
That was the goal, and then they saw the MRI, and then they were asked what exactly to classify.
In the fMRI, they didn't do anything. You just look, and then you record the brain activations, and you get ventral pallidum, striatum, amygdala coming up, sort of emotion, reward-related areas. Then, in a later phase, to check subliminality, though I said these can either be sexual, neutral, aversive, maybe null. Yeah, there are 4 categories: null, sexual, neutral, aversive. And they asked to classify the image into one of those categories. That was to check for subliminality. The dependent variable they record is a strange one, and they said it showed chance performance, but it didn't. They'd misinterpreted what they'd done.
So they're interpreting MRI scans to know their feelings towards those pictures?
Yeah, so let's just say we can interpret, the way they've interpreted these brain areas is to say they were right about those being reward areas. I'm myself always slightly doubtful about fMRI research because so much overfitting can go and back interpretation of any pattern of results. But let's just take their word for it. These are distinctively reward areas, as you would expect for rewarding stimuli, and that. Well, the story seems roughly right on that, as long as they didn't overfit the data too much. So it looks like reward areas are being stimulated by the rewarding pictures, but the pictures themselves, the authors claim, were not consciously seen. So the question, does that tell us anything about the feelings being unconscious? Or is it just the seeing was unconscious, you say? So that goes back to the point I keep making, always be clear about what mental state we know you do or do not have higher order thoughts about. They didn't check for higher order thoughts of seeing, but let's just say they didn't have them for the sake of the argument. We still don't know whether they had higher order thoughts of feeling, you see. So the feelings could be quite conscious in this experiment.
Conscious?
Yeah, why not? We've got no evidence one way or the other. Do we have any evidence for the higher order thoughts of feeling? No. So we don't know. Yeah. Okay, let's take an experiment I think is more interesting, but still ambiguous. This one really could do with a replication. It's quite old now and rather startling, and might be sort of slightly culturally or dependent on its time, but it'll be interesting to see. So what they did was you take something called a plethysmograph. Plethysmograph is a way of measuring the erotic response of a male or female. And in a male, it's a rubber tube that when it expands, it changes its electrical conductance. So you can put it on the penis and measure how hard a bloke gets by measuring the electrical resistance that it gives you. So they take men who claim to be straight, and they give them a homophobia questionnaire as well. So you can divide some of the men up into homophobics, straight homophobics, and the others are straights. You give them some erotic videos, and over time you can measure the change in penile circumference. This is for the heterosexual video, and you see about 2.5 centimetres change in circumference for both groups, homophobic and non-homophobic, about equally when they watch heterosexual erotic material. But now what's interesting is when you show them homoerotic videos. The homophobic men, I mean, you do get some small response from the non-homophobic men, but you get this rather larger response from the homophobic men, which is pretty much fully half the response they gave to straight videos. So they're getting a pretty strong response, erectile response, to homoerotic videos, despite them saying they hate gay people or it disgusts them and all this sort of thing. In fact, it seems to rather turn them on. So that's a nice finding, I think. But what does it tell us about unconscious desire? I mean, one interpretation is homophobes actually have unconscious desire or arousal for men. It's sort of something Freudian. They can't deal with it, they repress it, and the repressed desire comes up as shame and other feelings like that. Possible. So maybe this is an example of unconscious desire. But it need not be. They might be quite aware of their desire, but also ashamed of it. We don't have to postulate that it's unconscious, you see. And it's just that when you deal with issues where there's sort of strong social demands or expectations or norms about what you should feel, it can be easy to deny what you feel explicitly, no matter what you know you feel yourself consciously. And it could simply be a matter of that.
It's interesting that there's half of the maximum response. So I just wonder if they changed, they came out of the closet, if that would go up. So I wonder if you interpret the reduction of the maximum response as some kind of inhibition, like the amount of conscious control or the amount of priors.
Do you mean they really would experience the full response if they let themselves?
If they weren't so...
Yeah. I mean, here's a point. If they know they're being measured, so there must be some anxiety about what this might show. And they probably do their damnedest to make sure they don't show something. I mean, these sorts of control strategies can have ironic effects and can backfire. So I don't know if we know they really would have responded more outside this situation. I mean, this might have encouraged them to respond more because of the ironic effects of trying to stop yourself from responding. But it's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
There are also other studies like where you can measure skin conductance, and compared to the previous study with MRI, I think this is a better measure. Like some emotions can change the skin conductance, right?
Yeah. So you can measure skin conductance, and there's easier and less fiddly and there's less chance of overfitting than fMRI. But it's a bit blunt. At least with fMRI you can say it's these areas. With skin conductance, you get high arousal for all sorts of emotions. Whereas I guess the hope is with fMRI, positive versus negative emotions might produce somewhat different patterns, which they do tend to. So you can distinguish positive effect from negative effect.
Sure. I think it would help with, I wonder if there would be instances where skin conductance changes, but subjects, when asked, do not report any feeling that arose.
Yeah. So that would be a good experiment. If you can find an experiment that shows heightened skin conductance, but subjects saying no change in feeling, that would be good. We'll come to something like this towards the end of the lecture, in fact. So it can be quite difficult to measure whether feelings are unconscious so far. I mean, I think get some interesting cases, but we don't really know how to interpret them. But one example that's had a lot of press, you've probably come across, is the implicit attitude test. And I just want to run through that, give you a little example for you to experience it for yourself. So first of all, decide whether you think you're more on balance a cat person or a dog person. Would you rather have a cat or a dog? On balance. All right, so now we're going to test your sort of automatic reactions to cats and dogs to see if you can sense sort of automatically whether cats go with positive things more than dogs or dogs go with positive things more than cats. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to present you some words, and if you have a pen and paper as I go through the word, what I want you to do, if it's either a pleasant word or a dog word, dog related, tick the left side of your screen, of your paper. But if it's unpleasant or cat, then tick the right word, the right side of your screen, I mean. So it's like pressing a left or right button. The left button is for pleasant or dog, and the right button is for unpleasant or cat. So blood is unpleasant, so go on the right, but whiskers is cat related, and that would go on the right as well. Okay, you got that? So here we go. To see if you can react as quickly as you can and sense how difficult you find the task. Okay, you've done that. Now we're going to switch it round. So pleasant goes with cat on the left side, and unpleasant goes with dog on the right side. See if you find this easier or more difficult. Do people sense one way more difficult than another? Did it match your preference for cats or dogs? Seemed to work for some people and not others.
I thought that was on balance, but it seemed to have made the second easier, so I guess that makes me more of a cat person.
Do you think you're a cat person?
I own the cat, whereas
Okay.
I never own the dog.
Okay, so there you go.
Just the way you found it.
Yeah. So I hope that sort of illustrates the logic of the task. You take good and bad words and you pair it with something like this, I've done cats and dogs, to see if people have an automatic implicit preference for one of the categories more than the other. Okay, that's the idea of this. And the claim is that, which I'll come to, is that maybe you can get at your unconscious attitudes, because it's indirectly measured. We're not asking you how much you like cats or dogs. It's seeing how does your mind instinctively respond when it's set up in this indirect way. So could we find out what people implicitly like, quite apart from their conscious feelings, using this method? So it became famous. Greenwald, Banerjee and Nosek in the 90s developed this task. And it became famous for showing discrimination, especially racial, but also gender, but also we'll come to other things like obesity and age and all sorts of other things. So the finding they like to highlight, and they've got a book, Banerjee and Greenwald, they put in the reading list, sort of a popular overview of their findings, is that, well, the book was written in 2013, and since Trump, I wonder if this still is really the same, but apparently when you ask Americans, US people, about their racism, you get very little racism out on explicit reports. On questionnaires of racism, there isn't really much explicit racism. However, on this implicit attitude test, the IAT test, you get distinct measure of racism, meaning people are faster to pair black with negative words, black people-related words with negative words, and white with positive words than the other way around. So there seems to be an instinctive implicit racist bias, despite people claiming they're not racist. The way Banerjee and Greenwald interpret it is in terms of unconscious attitudes. You might think you're not racist, but maybe you are. So that's one interpretation. But we could also think about the things we've just been talking about. Is it really the case that US people, on average, don't think they're racist, don't know they're racist? That's kind of hard to believe given the last 5 years or so. It seems like genuine racism has been revealed. One suspects it was there up until 2013. It was just less socially acceptable to talk about it. So that's possible. It could also be, and I'll come back to this, that why should we think it reflects your attitudes, your feelings? Maybe simply it reflects your knowledge of the stereotypes. You know these things, that there are racist stereotypes in the culture. And that affects your reaction time. It's just semantic knowledge of the culture. Why do you have to interpret this as feelings? So I want to consider some evidence. How can we get at this? Well, let's say, okay, what we would like is another measure that indicates how you actually feel about things. So we're not just relying on subjective thought, oh, I'm not racist. Okay. Maybe that's just social desirability response. Is there something that social desirability finds hard to hide? So this paper was interesting, I thought, because they looked at humour. What is it that makes you laugh? And the idea is, as they put in the title, it's funny because we think it's true, that humour can illuminate the way you think about things. In fact, it might have evolved as a way of indicating knowledge. And that's why you have the in-group joke. People love the in-group joke, right? Because if you say something that's funny only to people in the know and they all laugh at it, it consolidates your group membership. And if someone does laugh at your in-group, you know that they're part of the in-group. only the in-group knows the code that makes us funny. So it's a way of testing people's genuine group membership. I find that an intriguing theory of humour. So in this experiment, people watch videos. They're just asked to look at the videos and evaluate them on some sort of bland dimensions. But what was actually happening was their face was being recorded, and people were trained, and this is sort of fairly standard, to notate which muscles were being activated in the person as they looked at the video. And you can take sort of laughter, smile muscles, and you can see the extent to which they have been activated by the videos. And one of them had sexist jokes in, how men do and should get paid more than women for the same job. And the other had racist jokes in about how scary it is to go to Harlem with all the black people there. And there was another video that was sort of neither racist nor sexist. Then they also did a racist and a gender IAT. And what you see is positive correlations here. Laughter at race jokes did correlate with race IAT. And laughter at sexist jokes did correlate with gender IAT. So I think that's good evidence. IAT doesn't just measure cultural stereotypes, semantic knowledge, but also some sort of affective emotional reaction. So there's something to it, but the correlations are small. And I want you to notice here that with this doesn't go through zero here. So you can apparently have a fair amount of IAT bias before you start laughing at the discriminating jokes. Do you notice that? So the IAT can indicate bias way before this indicates bias, the other measure. So I want to bear that in mind. So although there's probably something to the IAT measuring your genuine attitudes, I want you to hold in mind that it might be pretty imperfect, and there can be some other things going on, because I want to show you there are some other things going on. And also directly related to the point I'm trying to make, how do we know? Okay, so the IAT is measuring attitude to some extent, but we don't know it's unconscious yet. They didn't show it was unconscious. What we need to know is that the IAT would do a better job than a proper measure of expression of conscious feelings. Well, there have been some studies that have looked at this, which I'll go through. The upshot is, just to give you the punchline, the conscious measures were so weak as to be unreliable, so they don't really show what they're meant to show. But let me go through it because it's still interesting. The next two are interesting because they deal with relatively real-world scenarios, especially the next one. This one is relatively real-world in that it deals with real resident physicians, which means doctors. Although not dealing with real cases, they were given some vignettes and they were asked to say what the diagnosis was. But they were aware they weren't dealing with real patients, as it were. But it was a real setting with real doctors. Now the question is, when given the same case study, but with a black person pictured there or a white person, would they recommend the same treatment? Because there's one treatment that's a bit more expensive and the best, and another treatment that wouldn't be quite so good. And what's the extent to which they recommend the best treatment? The doctors were also given a IAT task to do with race. Now, the treatment with the best treatment goes for black people goes down the more racist the doctors come out on the IAT. So the more racist the doctors come out on the IAT, the less likely they are to prescribe the best treatment. There seems to be positive discrimination for the low bias doctors. Maybe they're somewhat aware of the nature of the task here and compensate, I'm not sure. But anyway, so there is evidence there that in a semi-real world setting, IAT correlates with actions a doctor would actually do that would make genuine health differences to the outcome. But when you ask them about explicitly about their racial attitudes, there was no significant correlation of treatment with racial preference. So this is sort of evidence that Banerjee and Greenwald cite for saying that it's unconscious. But what they consciously talk about their racism, it doesn't correlate with what they do. But the IAT correlates with what they do, say they would do. But in this study, they don't give the means, the actual data, for the, when I looked it up, for the explicit correlations. So I can't assess the sensitivity of that, nor can anyone else. We don't have the data. So that is rendered sort of irrelevant, really. Unless we can show that the measure was reliable and sensitive, it doesn't mean anything just because they got a non-significant result. Okay, now here's one that's quite striking because it's sort of real. Well, it is real. Real hiring managers were sent job applications, and the applications differed in how much weight the applicant has, as shown by the photo on the application. So some were fatter than others. Later managers took an obesity IAT to look at discrimination against people according to their weight. And they were given 2 explicit questions concerning weight prejudice. Now, this is a remarkable thing. A 1 standard deviation increase in implicit obesity prejudice lowered the callback rate, so the amount of time these applicants were called back, for an obese job applicant by 8 percentage points. That's enormous. So that's an enormous real-life effect in a real environment where these managers believed they were dealing with genuine applicants. That's predicted by IAT. But it was not predicted by the explicit attitude. Just to go back to the point about reliability, the IAT is a task where you do many, many trials. I switched it around once. In the real IAT, it switched around quite a number of times with all the different pairings. You do many, many trials. When you ask someone explicitly, what is your attitude towards people of different weights, asking one question is not very reliable. It's noisy. So you're less likely to get findings with noisy one-off items. And you can quantify this and work it out. So that's why I can say the explicit attitude was insensitive. We just can't conclude anything from it. Still, so the upshot of this is IAT does predict something of importance. It can do. But we don't know whether that's unconscious. The data just isn't sensitive enough to say that. And indeed, remember I said that there was, in the humour study, that you have to get to quite some negative IAT before you actually see negative behavioural consequences. And I want to present you evidence that could well be part of the reason for that is that there's a group of people for which the IAT works in the opposite direction, where a higher IAT discrimination score actually indicates greater empathic sensitivity towards the group, an attunement to the cultural norms and a resentment of those norms that is reflected in your IAT score. So Andrew, Chick and Jill present this hypothesis that if you endorse external attributions for African American status, in other words, the reason why African Americans have a poor lot in life often is because they were slaves before, they're treated badly, there's prejudice against them. Having positive and empathic views of their situation will show as an IAT score indicating a relation between negative attitudes and racism. So here's an example of an external explanation. The history of slavery, segregation, and discrimination suffered by African Americans has surely contributed to any current economic and social problems they are facing. Now, people who are high on external explanations, this is their IAT for racism. In other words, high means negative towards black. And this is the attitudes as consciously reported. Then what you see is that for these people, so the red line is high on external attributions, one standard deviation above the mean. The higher you score external attributions, then you get this positive correlation between your positive attitude towards black people, but racism is indicated by the IAT. In other words, if you're particularly concerned and empathic about the plight of African Americans, you come up as discriminating in the IAT precisely because of your sensitivity to those cultural stereotypes. So a high IAT score then doesn't indicate discrimination, it indicates precisely the opposite for that group of people. Does that make sense? But you see, there are other people who it does work as advertised. If you're low on external explanations, then the higher the IAT, the lower your explicit reported attitude to black people. So I don't know if you come. One reason I thought you might have come across the IAT is it has been used in many institutions, including Sussex. So some years ago, I was asked, all staff were said you should take gender IATs and things like this in human resources. It was run by human resources, and many institutions had human resource departments that thought people should take IATs. Now, I think there's many reasons for thinking this is a bad idea, and here's one of them. Your IAT score, first of all, on an individual level, is highly unreliable. It's sort of too noisy on an individual level for it to mean much. Even if it did mean something on an individual level, it might indicate the opposite to what you think it does. You might come to think you're racist unconsciously when you're not at all. It might also have negative effects on people. In this study in Canada, they had someone take a racial IAT and then talk with I think it was this was Canada, probably an Inuit person or an Aboriginal native of Canada anyway. They found when the white person had taken an IAT first, without feedback, and then had a conversation with the Inuit rated the conversation as going less well. And it could be that the IAT then had this negative effect by stopping a person being spontaneous, free, engaging, and actually harm the interaction. So it's not at all obvious that asking people to take IITs improves relationships between people afterwards. In fact, the only evidence I know of is this paper, which suggests the opposite. This body of evidence has caused a backlash, so we don't get asked to do IITs anymore, and I've seen in the news in the last 6 months that they've been dropped in other places as well. So the IIT is a complex mixture, and we still haven't quite gotten to the bottom of, is it unconscious or not? Because there's something in it. Okay, on an individual level it's a bit noisy, but over groups we can get these correlations. It can predict the right behaviours with a bit of an offset. When it does so, is that unconscious? Well, I only found a paper that answered the question. So it's based on the theory of Garan-Ronsky and Bodenhausen that the IIT doesn't measure your reflective attitudes. It measures your automatic, instinctive tendencies. But that doesn't mean they're unconscious. In fact, they're quite conscious. It just measures the reactions you spontaneously immediately have, whether you think they're valid or not. Whereas when you ask someone a self-reported attitude towards a group, you're taking into account not just some instinctive gut reaction, but your whole systems of belief that you have and what it is you feel should be the case. Just to give you an example, it's slightly dated now, but it's sort of one that stuck in my mind in the July 7th bombings of London Underground. I noticed then if I sat on a tube and someone who looked somewhat Islamic sat next to me with a backpack, I'd have an instinctive reaction. But it wasn't a reaction that I consciously endorsed as an appropriate reaction. It was just I'd seen on the news explosions from people wearing backpacks sitting in the tube. And that creates an emotional reaction and creates some associations that last for some time. And they can be sort of spontaneous, but that doesn't mean you're going with them. It doesn't mean you endorse them. And it doesn't mean you'll just sort of necessarily let them be. So the IIT may not be an unconscious attitude at all, to the extent that it is predicting in the right direction, which we see it does on average if you average over enough people. It could be a reaction you're quite aware of. So can we test this? So Hahn et al. Did it this way, and they've replicated this. They had people perform a number of IATs for a number of possible discriminative attitudes you could have. And they just explained before they did it, they explained what the IAT does. I mean, what's going to happen? You're going to press this button if it's a good word or black, and this button if it's a bad word and white, and then we're going to flip it around. And you might find it harder one way or the other. I want you to predict how well you're going to do, how big your response is on these different IATs. Okay. Will people know before they do the task what the task is going to give them, what the results are going to be? Just as I sort of asked you, are you a cat person or a dog person? I sort of asked if you could predict what it was going to be. They also took explicit attitudes, which is your on balance sort of reflective conclusion about what you really think, all things considered, about these different groups, Asian, celebrity, different ages, and so on. Now, the point is that the actual performance in the IAT, the measure of discrimination as given in the IAT, correlated with subjects' predictions of how they would do on that IAT, 0.6, which is rather large. In other words, people knew which IAT would come out most discriminating on themselves. So that means the reactions the IAT were eliciting were not unconscious. You might not agree with them. It might just be intuitive. There might not be a reflective opinion about things. And indeed, the IAT didn't correlate that much with their explicit attitudes. But that doesn't make them unconscious. Considered opinion need not be the same as an immediate reaction. But still, it all can be conscious. So, I reckon there is no evidence for unconscious attitudes revealed by the IAT.
I just wondered to what extent these results could also be explained by the degree of exposure that subjects had to, right, in the case of racial bias, to people of color. So, by the token of what's unknown, it's more likely scary than or negative valence. Or, you know, it measures the reaction time, right?
Yeah.
So if you're uncertain about something because you haven't been exposed to it, like, imagine, I mean, again, I wonder if that was controlled well. And probably it's class.
You mean do you mean they can guess, they can sort of work out what the IAT reactions are, not because they're aware of how much exposure they've had to different groups?
Talking about even earlier, not
Okay,
necessarily about
okay.
these other tests, but when you are just asked to, as quickly as possible, classify, does it go with pleasant or unpleasant? We don't live in 50-50 society where on average person next to me is of color. It's so I think we're not like I may not necessarily have bad or good experience. I just have less experience with people of color.
Yeah.
And then I imagine it could also give me a slower reaction time to classify. Does unknown go with better or good? I don't know. I have to think a little bit.
Yes. There is. I'm sure there's work on that. So the question is how much exposure to people of different groups affects prejudice, maybe as expressed in explicit reports, but also as expressed in IAT. There's an old hypothesis about that. I think it goes back to someone called Allport. I mean, decades, like almost 100 years ago. That what's important for prejudice is exposure to the other group, maybe especially in an environment where you're working together. And I'm not up enough in prejudice to say what the current findings are on that. But it strikes me as the sort of thing they would have done IATs with. So that if you look it up, I'm sure you'll get
All right, so
get some.
more places where people are actually more exposed.
Yeah, so I would take it where you're more exposed to different people. Plus, you have to work with them. You do work with them. Maybe you play football together. Then you get less prejudice. I think that came out in Brexit, that it was, all this immigrant prejudice. It was the places that had almost no immigrants that were most Brexit friendly. So that would fit a sort of exposure hypothesis. So that wraps up the first half of the lecture. I mean, I had no prejudice myself in terms of, I've been arguing all these other mental states are unconscious. So I was perfectly prepared for attitudes to be unconscious. We'll come back to the point you said, that maybe the feeling that feelings can't be unconscious. We'll come back to that. But I was prepared for them to be unconscious. But I just couldn't find the evidence. And it seemed to me that it is conscious, as far as I can tell, in the paradigms that the big paradigm that claimed there was measuring unconscious attitudes, to me, doesn't pan out. Are there any questions on that? All right, should we take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and consider emotions? Yeah.
Something that sort of came up through introspection again.
Oh, yeah.
I heard a statistic that most mind wandering, some like high proportion of mind wandering, is done rehearsing social scenarios.
Okay.
I can't remember where I heard it.
Makes a lot of sense, though. Yeah.
I wonder, because by introspections, sometimes it happens kind of on its own, and I would perceive a sort of unrealistic social scenario, but sometimes I happen to focus in more, and might imagine something that I'd say in a particular scenario that then affects my behaviour if a scenario like that were to come up.
Yeah.
So, how would you kind of interpret the degree of kind of conscious access, or would this be conscious or not if it influences my conscious behaviour?
Yeah. One thing I'll say about that is I think there's a function of mind wandering. Meditation, you try and stop your mind from wandering, and it's bloody difficult. And the reason why it's difficult, I think, is because your brain is constantly, the different bits of the brain are constantly trying to remind you of things that need doing, to make sure you don't forget this, and there's this task, and there's this one. And it's actually quite useful in a way, because it does get you to sort out problems that come in the future. Maybe including sort of problem, or definitely including sort of problem you're talking about, when this sort of social situation occurs in the future, this could be a way of solving it, or dealing with it. At least that's your mind's hope, by bringing it up in your mind wandering. So in that sense, the process is conscious and the mind wandering is conscious. You're not necessarily conscious of mind wandering at the time, but you're conscious of the scenario.
Yeah.
You're conscious of thinking about this social situation that you're thinking about.
Yes. Yeah.
But then the effect might not be deliberate. In that, when this social situation comes up, it might be like implicit memory effect we were talking about before. You just spontaneously enact the scenario that you've previously enacted in your mind wandering, without trying to enact that scenario. I could imagine that happen. So you could call it implicit. The causal connection might be implicit.
Yeah. Okay. I guess it's trying to assess the degree of how conscious the mind wandering was, and also the degree of consciousness about how I've been impacted by that.
Yeah, which are two different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you might not be aware you've been impacted by it.
Yeah.
But the mind wandering might have been a quite conscious experience at the time that it happened.
Yes.
Presumably
or
was.
Kind of vice versa.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I was considering asking you the question, and so it went through my head more than once. And,
right.
It might have been that I didn't think explicitly how am I going to word the question, but at the same time, that I might have also, my mind might have just wandered and subconsciously rehearsed it as well in ways that I'm not aware of now. So it's
yes. But you probably were conscious of the way you're enacting in your mind at the time that it happened. So it was a conscious experience at the time, even though you might not consciously recollect it later.
Right. I guess then so I guess that then there's a kind of niche of things that might have been conscious behaviours that don't get remembered, so can never be examined as conscious or unconscious.
A lot of that probably happens in our life, yeah. We just forgotten it ever happened. So, but it might have happened quite consciously at the time. Yeah.
I guess another question with mind wandering is, you said how from within the mind wandering state you don't necessarily have the kind of higher order awareness that you are mind wandering, but you might have an impact on a kind of more focused awareness of the situation being imagined than at another point when your mind is wandering. So,
yes.
So oddly conceptual. The component of reflecting on the fact that your mind is wandering. Is that just an example of higher order theory?
Yeah, that's So when you're mind wandering, you might be meant to be doing something else, but you're mind wandering. You'd still be, because you in mind wandering, if you're having conscious experiences like enacting this scenario in your head, there are higher order thoughts. There's the first thought, I'm imagining Bill, and so on, and I'm imagining him doing this, I'm imagining this. So there's higher order thoughts going on. But those higher order thoughts just characterise your mental state as imagining this, imagining that. They don't characterise it as mind wandering. So when you then have the higher order thought that you're mind wandering, that is another higher order thought. And now you see the mental state in a slightly different way. You're aware of it. It appears to you in a slightly different way, namely as mind wandering. So you did have higher order thoughts before then. But what you characterised the first order mental state as became different. It became mind wandering rather than simply imagining. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I mean that gives a more solid understanding of higher order thought as well.
Right.
But it. I guess I would be monitoring, probably using sort of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at a guess.
Yeah.
Would be monitoring my internal mind wandering, or whatever thought, whether it's mind wandering or other introspection. There'd be a sense of monitoring, and do I want to continue having this thought?
Yes.
Which would be a kind of conscious awareness of the thought and an ability to intercept the thought and switch to another, but at the same time I'm what feels like consciously deciding to remain within the particular thought.
Yes, right.
So where's the higher order? What constitutes what constitutes the higher order?
Well, there's lots of higher order things going on there, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's just a second order thought that you're having a thought.
Yeah.
There would be the second order or third order thought related to whether it's mind wandering or not, which may or may not happen, as we've been saying. But then, as you say, there's not just monitoring awareness processes, there's regulation processes, control processes. You might have the thought you want to think about another thought, you want to stop this train of thought, or engage in this train of thought. And that thought can have higher order thoughts about it as well. So, it's quite a tangle of...
So then, I mean, in the process of untangling and figuring out what's going on, I guess we want to know when does the phenomenology of the thought begin, and the kind of the neuronal set of neuronal processes end. At some point, it feels like a thought as opposed to feeling like a set of processes. Is that one of the questions that we want to ask?
So it sounds like an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. I mean, do you wonder how much could acute knowledge of thinking processes impact the processes themselves? If you're asked to think explicitly about if the subject was given knowledge on how mind wandering works, so the kind of processes that underpin it, and then was asked to reflect on those every time they notice one occur. Would you expect some sort of impact?
Well, that's meditation, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what meditation is a set of exercises in which this process is explored.
Yeah.
How can you control your thought when all you have is thought? There are just thoughts there.
Yeah.
How do you make it so that the thoughts run in certain directions? And indeed, there is an art to this, and that's meditation. So it does work, but it's a tricky process. Because if you simply try and suppress thought, you can get ironic rebound. Don't think about a white bear. You just keep thinking about it.
Yeah.
So meditative practices are an attempt to bypass all these little tricks of the mind to bring about some control.
I've heard it referred to as a. I don't know if you've heard of Sam Harris's book Waking Up.
Yeah, I've read it. Yeah.
A friend just gave it to me. Only 20, 30 pages in. He's still sort of justifying it, and he's beginning to explain how Buddhism is, despite there being a lot of hoo-ha around other Eastern mysticism, there seems to be a kind of empirical approach to the
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
I mean, when he says it, I don't know precisely what he means by empirical. Yeah. So in this context, is it something that is in a battle, and all you can do is experience and relay suggestions about how to approach thought on the assumption that other people's ironic rebound, for example, works the same?
Well, it's empirical in that you can explore for yourself. So you don't have to take some meditation master's word for it. You can try these exercises and you see what happens in your mind when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
You might have to persist. You can't just do it for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But you come to see there are sort of regularities and ways that thought works, which can be used to tame it. And you can directly experience that yourself.
Okay.
So having said all that, people say this about Buddhism, and sort of Buddha himself said, you can see this for yourself. There's also a lot of cultish authoritarianism in Buddhist sects as well. So I don't want to sort of say it's all empirical and find out for yourself. But there is definitely that aspect of Buddhism you can extract from it.
Yeah.
And that's the bit I extract to play with.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's definitely appropriately confused. Thank you.
All right, so let's carry on with emotion. So the first thing I want you to ask yourselves, you could introduce yourself again to the person next to you, and say, could you be happy and not know it? Could you be happy and not know it? Is that possible? Discuss with the person next to you.
I guess you feel happy and then you reflect on it afterwards.
So any thoughts? Can you be happy and not know it?
Yes, in rare and tried social situations. But
So
generally speaking, it's not typical.
It's not typical, but it's possible at least.
Yeah.
So we could have unconscious happiness. Do people agree with that? You're shaking your head.
I mean, it's something you feel as well, like when you're happy, everything's different, like your body reactions are different, your view of the world is different, how you interpret things are different, your mental state is different, everything is different, and I think you just know it.
Yeah. So the point was everything, when you're in a mood like happiness, it transforms you globally. You react to the world differently. So you're saying, because everything's different, you would notice it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think generally speaking, people aren't always happy 24/7, so when it does happen, you know the difference between a sad day or a normal day,
Yeah.
kind of really exciting, and a happy day.
So it'd be too striking to miss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
What about if it was what about if it was a little bit of happiness? Might you miss it?
a little bit of happiness.
Yeah. You consciously feel that, you reckon?
I guess, what's the difference between being content and being happy?
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line between content and happy? Yeah.
Yeah, I know that's like a...
How would you
What's
define
my-
content then?
You're not happy enough, but you're not sad. You're just kind of
So
it's
then
neutrally content.
Yeah.
So it's like, well,
Just a little bit of
I know it's
happiness.
like arbitrary when you define these lines, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of...
All right. So there's not really a right answer to that. I mean, different experts give different answers. I mean, different experts, say sort of researchers, like to think about it differently. I think one thing that will help us is to think about what is an emotion, sort of as you were doing before. So one theory that goes back a long way is an emotion is an appraisal of a situation. An appraisal means you're evaluating, it's an evaluation, a proposition about what the situation means to your survival, core goals and aims, to your success in your endeavours. For example, fear would not be fear if you didn't expect something bad to happen imminently. It has to be this sort of cognitive appraisal. Something bad is about to happen really soon. Because if you didn't have that, it wouldn't be afraid. You wouldn't be afraid. I mean, your heart might be beating fast, but why is that fear? Unless you thought something really bad was going to happen. So that's appraisal theory. There's also, as you were saying, cognitive changes. People look at how narrow your attention is or broad your attention is, being biased to certain sorts of information rather than other sorts of information. These things change in different emotions. If physiological changes, heart rate, blood pressure, so on. Behavioural changes, squeezing of fists or shaking or other actions that one performs. But there is, as has been said, also just a feeling or phenomenology. Just what is it like to be happy? Now, if we define that as being conscious, the phenomenology is something conscious, then by definition, happiness is conscious. So if you want to go that route, you say you couldn't be happy and not know it because happiness needs a conscious phenomenology. Okay, that's sort of defining it that way. But if we just sort of put aside conscious phenomenology, so we don't insist it has to be conscious, we've got all these other things, and we could ask, could they be unconscious? So could you be in this sort of global state without being aware about it? So now emotion, first of all, emotion is an appraisal or judgment. Now the idea actually that emotion is an appraisal or judgment and an associated action tendency. For example, anger is an injustice against me has happened, revenge must be taken. That goes back to Chrysippus, the Greek Stoic philosopher, about 250 BC. He had drawn on Aristotle, but he elaborated it particularly well as an appraisal theory of emotion. So that theory that constitutes emotion, in a big part, is a very old one, and has revived in the recent emotion literature as well. Emotion is fundamentally an appraisal. But when we talked about implicit learning, we talked about judgments could be unconscious, didn't we? So if we think an appraisal is a big part of what it is to be an emotion, we said, well, that can be unconscious. We've already got evidence for other sorts of judgments being unconscious. So the appraisal could be unconscious. Chrysippus also said there was another side to emotion, which is a perception of movements of your inner state. He meant physiology in modern language. It's a perception of an inner physiological state. So William James would be a person recently who would incorporate that. He thought it was perception of your behaviours, but also your inner physiological state, your interceptive state. Anil Seth proposes a theory of emotion like that currently. It's your perception of according to Anil, it's the perception of your internal body state as caused by certain environmental circumstances. Well, we've talked about perceptions being unconscious. No reason why perceptions have to be conscious. So perceiving one's inner state could be subliminal as well. So that aspect could be unconscious. There's another theory I'll add in here. Say Brian Parkinson at Oxford has, that emotion is a social signal. I mean, why is it that we wear emotions on our face, as it were? We make it kind of obvious. They're hard to hide, aren't they? They're sort of a compulsive social display. So it seems they're not, like facial expressions, seem to give the game away that emotion is meant to be a social signal. It's meant to be telling other creatures something about your state. So anger could be saying, you need to take my interests more seriously, mate. That's the function of anger, saying take me seriously. It's a social signal. And that sounds rather plausible to me as well. I mean, all these claims actually sound plausible to me. I don't want to take any sides on them. But a signal can be unconscious. No reason why you have to be aware that you're signalling. Right? So if we sort of just strip away the conscious feeling and say, what about everything else that constitutes the emotion? It seems to me that it could be unconscious. So whether you want to go with stripping away the conscious feeling leaves you with an emotion or not is sort of, to me, just a semantic thing. It's just a matter of... If we want to talk about unconscious emotions, we need to talk about something which isn't just the conscious feeling. And it seems we can do that, and if these things here were all happening, but without our awareness of them happening, that would be an interesting case of at least something pretty close to unconscious emotion. Now, in fact, if you look back in the history of when were unconscious mental states postulated, I mean, we tend to think of maybe Freud talking about unconscious mental states, but it goes back a long way. Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, suggests, and this is the earliest claim I can find too, that the notion of an unconscious mental state, the earliest we can find is Lucretius, who was a Roman, flourished around 75 BC. He followed a Greek called Epicurus, Epicurus was about 250 BC, 300 BC. So Lucretius was spelling out Epicurus' philosophy. So this probably goes back to Epicurus, but we've lost much of Epicurus' writings. But in any case, we know it's in Lucretius. And the argument was that people have a fear of death, but it becomes unconscious. It's too much to bear. But the way they try and solve this unconscious fear of death is by these things: subservience to religious beliefs, lust for power, greedy accumulation of wealth, frantic activity that never seems to console. In other words, it's an attempt to overcome your own mortality by creating things that are going to last longer, creating fame, wealth, and so on. Try and make yourself bigger, extend yourself in some way. And the solution, according to Lucretius, was to be aware of the fear and conquer it. To face your fear of death, to recognise it, make yourself conscious of it, and then conquer it until you fear death no longer. And then you'll live a happier life. So that's an interesting theory, and it has a plausibility to it, I think, because we see it resurrected in terror management theory. I don't know if they knew Epicurus had said this and Lucretius earlier. I haven't read terror management theory that closely, but it's really the same theory resurrected a couple of thousand years later. What they say is being reminded of one's mortality brings terror. This terror is too much to bear, so it becomes unconscious. But even though it's unconscious, we have to deal with it. And the way we deal with it is by making ourselves part of something that's bigger than us, lasts longer than us, and from our point of view is more or less immortal, namely our culture. and the key beliefs of our culture, we then buy into more strongly. We become more entrenched in the worldview of the people around us, of the group that we belong to. That's terror management theory. So here's an example which might show unconscious fear of death. So I ask you to see if you think it does. So this is what terror management theory people do. First of all, they say they prime mortality salience. That's the term they use. What they mean is you write down emotions about your own death. This would be a typical manipulation. You just write down what you think about your own death. Okay. So this is meant to, first of all, pump up your death terror, but then you're going to push it down, make it unconscious. A control, something neutral, you write down, another group who write down emotions about TV, but we also want another group that has anxiety, just not about death, and they write about the emotions about taking the next exam. So this is typical so far. Terror management theory is a big literature, been around decades. This first phase is what they standardly do. Then the next phase is they look at, does this make you buy into cultural stereotypes more? So let's say a woman has been, so this is in the US, a woman has been charged with prostitution. How much bail should she, or bond should she pay? That is, how much money do you leave with the court in order to get free about your life until the judge passes sentence on you? So the idea is, because of a certain amount of prudery in the US as its basic sort of cultural beliefs, that when you're afraid of death, you'll buy into that sort of prejudice against sexual activity, and you'll be stricter on the prostitute. She's violating cultural norms, she should be punished. But was the emotion conscious or unconscious? So what they get people to do is to rate their feelings. What do they consciously feel? How distressed, upset, hostile, irritable, scared, afraid, ashamed, guilty and nervous, and jittery do they feel? So we can see if there's any increase in negative emotion due to the manipulation. So this is what they found. In terms of the emotions, mortality salience, MS means mortality salience. This is the exam group, this is the TV group. The exam group had an increase in negative emotions. Look, the mortality salience group is about the same as the TV group. So writing about your own death, apparently, didn't make people feel more jittery, afraid, scared, and so on. But writing about an exam did. So this is the first bit of evidence. Surely writing about your death pumps your death terror, but people don't show it. So is it unconscious? Well, we need some evidence that there's something there that's made a difference. And look at this huge effect. The mortality salience group, they asked for a much bigger bond than the other two groups. Like they bought into the cultural worldview that prostitution is a shameful activity that shouldn't happen in our society, so we should be pretty tough on them. So, according to the theory, fear of death increased by mortality salience priming, yet conscious negative feelings did not change. So there was an unconscious fear of death. Just discuss with the person next to you whether you think, how good is that evidence? Have we established an unconscious emotion with this experiment?
the age group was just 40, 50, 60 years, still really far from actually dying. Maybe they didn't actually put their minds into it. But the second one, I guess, no. To what extent?
Just treating it as like, yeah, they're anxious. It could be measuring an age for getting calls. It doesn't seem to be so clear. So the same lower bond because they're afraid of community trauma.
All right, any thoughts?
I don't understand how this is supposed to measure unconscious fear of death.
Right.
What's the relationship between the mortality salience and that group being more strict towards the bond payments?
Yes, I mean, so that goes back to this is what the theory says. The theory says if you are afraid of death, you'll buy into your cultural values in a more strict, rigid way.
But how does that make them, like, how does that contribute to a sense of immortality? Because the Fae were like, well, if I would understand them,
Yeah,
you're like known for it after your death, you're still known by the people.
yeah.
But how does that contribute to?
Yeah, so that's what Lucretius said, lust for fame. Your fame outlives you, right? But the argument here is something else outlives you, your world, the cultural worldview, the group to which you're a part. So if you become a part of that group and that worldview, you're becoming part of something that's immortal. I think that's the argument. But your point is, how do we know this is fear of death? They didn't measure fear of death, did they?
They did mortality salience, which didn't seem to really impact their negative emotions anyway.
Yeah, but these negative emotions don't say, how afraid are you of dying? We haven't actually directly asked that question. We asked lots of questions like ashamed, irritable. It could have got lost out in the wash here. It would have been quite nice just to know what people say about how afraid are you of dying, since that's the key construct here, but it wasn't actually measured. So that's a bit funny. And also, it might not be that this works by increasing fear of death at all. It might be when your mortality is primed, there's an instinctive reaction, not because of fear of death, it's just become instinctive, to bond more closely with your group, to be part of the group. It's just direct. If you're put under threat, pull together with your group. It could be just a primate instinct. I mean, I reckon other primates do this. If you threaten the primate, they're going to get their mates. Not necessarily because they're afraid of death. It's just primates are social creatures, and the bigger the social gang you've got against the other gang, the better your chances are. Just a continuation of that. Why do we have to think that there's some huge terror of death that's been bubbling up in the person because of this? You're just pulling together with your mates. Does that make sense? So I'm not entirely sure. I kind of like the idea, because maybe partly because it goes back to Lucretius and Epicurus. Has a certain amount of sense to it. But I want to point out, the credibility crisis or the replication crisis. There have been a couple of large-scale replications of terror management theory which have failed to get their results. Not this particular experiment, which is the best experiment I could find to make the point I wanted to make. But it looks like terror management theory might not be on such solid ground. I'm not entirely sure it actually holds up at all, even given the provisos I've said. All right, now I want to look at another interesting set of experiments which I think get us a bit closer. I'll say maybe they don't get us all the way there, but they are extremely intriguing. Weinberger, Schwartz and Davidson came up with the notion of a repressor, which is people who actually have high anxiety but are not aware of it. So how do you measure these people? You can have what are called trait anxiety scales. which is just asking people in everyday life, how nervous do you get about various things, how worried do you get about things, how anxious are you about things. You ask them 20-odd questions like that. And you can then divide people into people low on the scale, low trait anxiety, and people high trait anxiety. Fair enough so far. Just some people are more anxious than others. That's life. Now you have another sort of scale. The Marlowe-Crown is an example, but it's not the only one. You ask questions like, I never lie. Do you agree or disagree? I never lie. Well, everyone lies. So why would you say you never lie? There must be some sort of, you could say, defensiveness or deception going on, because everyone lies sometimes. I never hesitate to go out of my way to help someone in trouble. You don't always help someone in trouble. Okay? That can't be the case. Every little person who needs some little help, you go and help them. That can't be the case. But it's socially desirable to never lie, and it's socially desirable to help anybody who's in some trouble. So when a person says yes to these items, they're doing the socially desirable thing. So it's often called a social desirability scale. But who are you kidding? You could be kidding yourself. You might genuinely believe you never lie. Okay? So if this, to the extent this measures self-deception, it's possible if we select the people high in Marlowe-Crown and low trait anxiety, we're getting repressors. These are people who deceive themselves to believe they are the way they think they should be. But because they're saying the low anxiety, it's very possible that a lot of these people actually have high anxiety and are therefore repressors. Does that make sense? Of course, we don't know that for sure. The Marlowe-Crown might be measuring other deception. You know you lie sometimes, you just don't want to admit it. But let's say there is a group of people who are self-deceivers. And amongst these low anxiety people, some are actually high anxiety, but they're deceiving themselves. So then would isolate within this way of measuring things, there would be a subset of these people who are genuine repressors, who actually have high anxiety, but believe they don't. At least it's possible, right? So let's see. So Naz Derrickson, who was at Sussex for a few years, some decades ago, worked with Michael Eysenck on this for a while, with some interesting experiments. Let's put people in a situation. So when you were mentioning skin conductance before, this is what I was thinking about. It's actually heart rate rather than skin conductance, but it's something like you were talking about. Put people in a situation where typically people get nervous, like public talk. Okay? They're videoed, and while they're talking, the heart rate is monitored. They rate their own anxiety halfway through the talk. That's what they consciously think their anxiety is. The self-rating, that's the higher order thought about the state of anxiety that they're in. But there are also independent judges that looked at the videos and, how much were these people fiddling, and just rated how anxious this person seems to the independent judges. Now, so we've got these different types. You've got people who are low deceivers, self or other, and low trait anxiety. We can regard them as genuinely low anxious. And these low deceivers who are high trait anxiety are genuinely high anxious. Okay? And then the other group is, they call defensive high anxious. If you look at the heart rate, the low anxious group indeed has a lower heart rate than the others while giving this talk. But look at the repressors. The repressors have the same heart rate as the high anxious people. So according to what you're saying about getting high arousal by a physiological measure, we've achieved it in the repressors. They have this measure of physiological arousal just as much as a high anxious group. But now this is the light bars here, the self-rated anxiety. This is the low anxious, these bars. This is the repressors. the repressors actually rate themselves as having lower anxiety than the low anxious. But what did the judges rate them as? The judges rate the repressors as having higher anxiety than the low anxious. So I think that's kind of cute. So people can believe they're low anxious, people in general. They can believe they're not actually anxious while giving this public talk. But people looking at them saying, yeah, you look pretty anxious to me. So let's go back to a couple of issues one might have. Are they self-deceivers or other deceivers? Remember I raised this issue, this only works, and it's sort of the issue I've been talking about all the way through. I mean, maybe they say they don't feel anxiety because they think they shouldn't, just like racists say they're not racist because they think they shouldn't. Homophobes say they're not aroused to men because they think they shouldn't be, and so on. Is this just another manifestation of that same problem? To what extent should we believe that what they say about themselves, they believe about themselves? I don't know if you've heard of this strange phrase, the bogus pipeline, which just means you rig someone up to a lie detector. And you're not really interested in the lie detector working or not because they don't work that well. But as long as the person believes the lie detector works, you put them under pressure and say, now tell me the truth. What were you feeling? Okay. That's the bogus pipeline. It's called bogus because you don't really believe the lie detector works, but you want them to believe it does work, and you hope they crack under pressure if they believe it. But they hold up to that. Repressors maintain the low anxiety ratings. Not all studies replicate heightened physiological measures of arousal in repressors. I mean, this was a nice study that did, not all of them show that. But 50% do in a fairly large number of studies. And that is the average power of psychology experiments. So I think that result does hold up, in fact, the body of evidence as a whole. If we believe the selection of literature that's there, for 50% of studies to show it is convincing. Yeah.
Were they showing the results of their heart rate?
I can't remember if the paper mentions they were given feedback on this and say, just for your own sake, for the future, you were pretty nervous, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a better idea, like after all of this, wouldn't it be good to ask them, did you feel your heart rate going faster?
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. So the question is, why not present them with the evidence of the heart rate going faster and saying, did you not feel that? Or just ask them what they estimated the heart rate as. Yeah.
So that wasn't done.
I have no memory of that now, so I think that wasn't done, no, that's right. Yeah. So, but that would be an interesting... That's sometimes done in hypnosis studies. You present people with the evidence that it isn't how they think it is. Do they crack? So you could do that here as well with the repressors. That would be a good study. Now notice, though, that the repressors are not saying they have zero anxiety. See, if this is a higher anxiety than normal, then the repressors are still aware that they do have some anxiety. So then the anxiety isn't completely unconscious. They're just expressing it on their scale of saying how anxious they are, might just be a bit compressed. So does this really mean that it's unconscious anxiety? Maybe repressors just move over smaller scale space. So that is my one proviso about this. It does seem they are aware of some anxiety, so is it really unconscious?
It's very relevant, but most of what you said last week, you had towards the end of the lecture, these autism versus schizophrenia predictive explanations and it seems like priors in these repressors case seem to be very highly biased. So they're unlikely to take new evidence, which is at a lower weight.
Yes, that's a very good way of thinking about it. So the question is, like we're talking about autism last lecture, repressors might just have a low prior for being anxious. So what you're according to predictive processing or Bayesian model of the brain, your final conscious experience is a combination of your prior plus the evidence. So naturally, if your prior is you're a very low anxious sort of person, your final conscious experience is not so anxious. Maybe that is how it works for repressors. So it's not that they're not taking into account the evidence. It does combine with the prior and lift the anxiety a bit, but just doesn't lift it as much as other people whose priors recognise a greater tendency to become anxious. Yeah, but that doesn't make it unconscious, I think one could say. As long as your posterior, your final estimate, includes some increase in anxiety because of the evidence, then you're being sensitive to the evidence. So that could be a way of looking at this and saying it's sort of close to unconscious anxiety, but you wouldn't want to say it is in an absolute sense. So now here's a study which I regard as the most sort of classic study, show unconscious emotions. So I asked here, could we get a case where there's no change in conscious emotion, while behavioural indices find change? Then that would be more compelling, given the points I've just made for unconscious emotion. So Winkelmann, University of California, ran this study. The way he did it was to present facial images to people, happy, neutral, or angry, which were subliminal, he said. 16 milliseconds flashing, very, very fast, followed by a back mask. Now, the idea here is when you're feeling down, your tendency to engage with the world is less. Right? You don't want to approach the world. You don't want to do things in the world. When you're feeling happy, you're more likely to want to engage with the world and do things. So the way he measured that was the amount of drink. So this is where you think, does this really measure this or not? But it is still interesting. You give people a drink to drink. You see, they pour how much they want. And it's not alcoholic. You might say if it's an alcoholic drink, when you're down, you just want to. Some people want to drown their sorrows, but this is not non-alcoholic. You see how much drink. They choose to drink themselves, and then they rate their mood and arousal. Okay. So. It depends on how thirsty you are, so we have to just take the thirsty subjects. The subjects giving the happy face drank more drink than those giving the angry face. But you have to be thirsty to show that effect, which I suppose is... We've had thirst as a moderator in previous experiments with subliminal priming. It sort of makes sense. Of course, if you're not thirsty, you're not going to see much. But amongst the thirsty subjects, those giving the happy face drank more than those giving the angry face. Okay? So they engaged with the world more. They wanted to participate, consume, enjoy. But when you looked at the mood ratings, there was a non-significant difference between them. So this is poured and this is drunk. You get the same results. Mood is in valence, positive or negative, and this is how aroused you feel. But you could think of those as two components of mood, valence and arousal, all non-significant. So the claim is there was a non-significant difference in mood between the groups. So the temptations include there was no difference in rated feelings, but people behaved in a way that was consistent with the way they were emotionally primed. They wanted to consume and engage more and enjoy that. Maybe. So have we induced a happy mood without people knowing it? What do you reckon?
So what was the question?
So do you think this is successful in showing unconscious mood, emotion?
The measure seems very... I don't like it. I can imagine, like, if I'm giving a talk, I usually drink more.
Yeah.
But So it seems, at least in my mind, goes against the findings here.
Maybe when you're, yeah. So we don't have solid evidence here that being happy makes you pour more drink and drink more drink. I mean, it goes that way, but we didn't have independent evidence that is the way it's got to happen. So is our measure of mood really a measure of how positive or negative your mood is? Yeah.
Why didn't they make them participate in a group event, like, I don't know, a debate or something?
Why did they make them?
Why was the measure of happiness or mood water drinking rather than a social event where they would actually engage?
Yeah. So the question is, could we not have a more ecologically, a sort of a measure with greater face validity to do with mood? The amount of, I don't know, I'm not sure this was water, it might have been cordial or, some soft drink. But anyway, it's not what you intrinsically take to be a measure of, what you do when you're really happy. I have a bigger drink of cordial. But what you're saying is the way you engage with people socially in a group is a lot about what happiness is about.
I think one measure would be like how many conversations you strike with total strangers.
Yeah.
This openness to the world, that and readiness to engage. That I think that's a much better measure.
Yeah.
I can see that in myself. When I'm happy, I'm more likely to strike a random conversation.
Yes. So the point is, why not? Number of conversations engaged with strangers would have more face validity than drink. Let's look at one that maybe has a little bit more face validity. This is from National University of Singapore. It uses appraisal theory. So it flashes a prime either unfair or fair, which is a key part of the appraisal for anger. If someone has treated you unfairly, that's part of the appraisal that constitutes anger on appraisal theory. And then, remember, he said you can measure musculature. You can video people. You can train people to detect the muscle activations of precise facial muscles, and you can see whether the anger muscles increase. And that's what they got in this experiment. The relevant prime produced a more angry facial expression without significant change in rated emotion. Maybe face expresses emotion better than, or more specifically, than drink consumption. Both these experiments, however, I think would need to be replicated before we believe them anyway. Given the failure of one-off experiments to replicate, that's a genuine concern. But let's say this one replicated. What would you reckon to that?
That one would be conscious.
Yeah, so does this show unconscious anger?
Yes.
Yeah, you're more... So the facial expression measure does it more for you than drinking cordial? Yeah. If it replicates. And not only would it have to replicate, it would have to replicate with a better measure of no change. So I just want to highlight something that's important in many experiments, in all the research that you do. This is the way the logic has gone in that experiment, and many. You get a significant change in behavioural measure of emotion, or physiological or facial, but no significant change in rated emotion. And you say there was no change in conscious emotion, so emotion unconscious. That's sort of the logic of what we've just done. Objective threshold is very similar. You say there's a significant change in priming, but they're non-significantly above chance and objective measures. So you say objective performance was a chance, so perception was unconscious. And you can say the same with some other measures, like there's no relationship between confidence and accuracy, no significant relationship. You conclude there was no relationship, so knowledge unconscious. The thing I want you to be aware of, I'm just going to do a tiny bit of statistics, but it's relevant to every bit of research that you evaluate. significance, when you use a p-value, you know, p less than 0.05, that's significance testing, it makes a very funny sort of distinction. We set up the worlds, we say there's two hypotheses, H0. H0 means no difference. That's the hypothesis of no difference. H1 is the hypothesis of difference. We would like to divide the world into three states of affairs from our data. They've got evidence for no difference, but maybe there was just no evidence. The evidence wasn't good enough. Or we had evidence for a difference. That's what we'd like to know what our data is telling us. But a p-value, significance testing, does not make that three-way distinction. Non-significance does not distinguish evidence for no difference from no evidence. You should suspend judgment. You just got no evidence. It doesn't distinguish these states of affairs. So when there was no significant change in rated emotion, we don't know what that means. We can't conclude from non-significance there was no effect. It might just mean the evidence wasn't good enough. There is a way of dealing with that. You can use something called Bayes factors that does make that three-way distinction. So it's not as if it's an impossible problem. It's not as if I'm just being some academic demanding things that can't exist. They do exist. We do have the tools to do it. But that hasn't been done. So if you use Bayes factors in this, we could redo the logic and we could say, so these experiments that need replicating, we can say, was there actually evidence for no change in emotion? Was there positive evidence for that? So that's what we need to do. So that was a just sort of methodological detour, but it's quite important generally for you understanding what research tells one. So that was my attempt to explore whether emotions can be unconscious. I think the evidence is that perhaps a little bit better than attitudes. There's some intriguing studies there. But I think for all of those studies, you weren't quite convinced, were you, on the emotion issue. And indeed, there's some people, Mark Soames, for example, has just written a book on consciousness, who thinks emotions have to be conscious all the time. Feelings are always conscious, is his claim. But I think that comes about from taking feelings to be conscious feelings as a matter of definition. But then the claim is just semantic, it's just meaningless. If we allow for emotions to still be really an emotion, except for the conscious feeling part, it seems to me entirely logically possible we can have unconscious emotions. It's just that we haven't quite been able to get the really solid evidence. But there's a number of lines of evidence there that maybe, you know, in your research reports, if you followed up on, you might be able to nail it down. I mean, we don't seem that far off the issue. There's a number of ways of getting close to it that might hold up if explored just a little bit more. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
I don't know. It's not a question. It's more like a statement. I feel like the human survival, like the social survival of humans, wouldn't it be more logical though to have a conscious experience of positive emotions like happiness and feel all of these things which are key to our mental health, and repressing, for example, the anxiety that the repressors felt as a coping mechanism. So isn't that more a therapy issue rather than just a therapy issue?
So the point is, in terms of us doing well in life, is it not better that, even from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, all evolution cares about is behaviour, though, not our inner feelings. As long as we do the right things to reproduce and allow our children to reproduce, evolution barely cares what our mental health is. So one argument is that mental health issues actually arise out of evolutionary considerations, because evolution doesn't care about our happiness in a sense.
I think it's more on the cognitive side rather than biological evolution and reproduction.
It's more of a
social acceptance. Since we're social animals, would it be logical to repress that anxiety to be more part of something. I don't know how to make
I
sense.
don't think we social forever, like 50,000 years ago. We kind of lived.
I mean, we always relied on groups.
Yeah. I think we've probably been groups as long as we've been humans. So socialising has been important. But part of managing, I mean, different cultures have different different norms about what emotions are appropriate. And we have to regulate our emotions to fit in with those norms, to fit in with those societies. So in some societies, jealousy is utterly inappropriate. You share partners, and if you were to show jealousy, that would be utterly shameful. Other societies, to show jealousy is heroic, and part of being, is good. Sort of machismo cultures, and so you cultivate it, and so on for the whole range of emotions. So some form of regulation of your emotion, and perhaps even some deception to yourself of what you're feeling, so you can deceive others about what you're feeling, might be useful for negotiating an environment where what we're evolutionarily given with is tendencies to have all sorts of feelings in all sorts of ways, but we have to mould them to the culture we're a part of. So maybe some sort of repression like that has been beneficial, possibly.
So for the improvements, wouldn't it be good to have like a certified therapist that can actually? It would be a lot of effort and way more time consuming, obviously, but to really determine whether emotions are unconscious or not, wouldn't it be good to have trained therapists that individually talk with these subjects to actually see if those emotions were conscious or unconscious?
Yeah, so the point is, why not bring in therapists? Could we bring in some more clinical type practices to look at the young? Because surely it's in the clinical practice that the issue, at least for some therapy, the issue of unconscious emotion comes up. So I think that could be an interesting way to look. I mean, some therapies avoid that issue, like cognitive behavioural therapy, but more Freudian theories do go into unconscious emotions. Freud himself thought there were not unconscious emotions. There are unconscious desires, but not unconscious emotions. But the Freudian tradition is a lot richer than Freud, and there are, intensive short-term psychodynamic therapy postulates unconscious grief and unconscious anger and unconscious shame that need to be brought to the surface. Whether one can show that in a controlled way, I'm not sure. But you're right, there feels like there should be some sort of interesting discussion there, if we could bring in clinical people. And the sorts of examples they deal with, which might be better than Mickey Mouse examples that we deal with in the lab. So that could be an interesting way to explore in your reading and writing on this, or thinking, and for the field. So next week we're going to do hypnosis. For the first hour of the session, I'll take you through a hypnosis procedure as a class, and you'll be welcome to. You can choose to go along with it. You could sit there quietly and not do it. That's up to you. Or you can, which is what I recommend, is you just see if your hands become like magnets and attract themselves together. And so I wanted to see what experiences you do or do not have when we go through some standard hypnotic suggestions, none of which will be embarrassing. There'll just be things like moving your arms around and imagining various things. So that's just to give you some experience. You may have experienced some hypnosis before, that's fine. This is a chance to experience it again, or experience it for the first time. And then in the second half, we'll start giving that experience, going through theories of hypnosis.